something to believe in along the way.
That's what I like to do every winter, you get a good cold blizzard, whatever, is watch Lonesome Dove. Now, there's 6 hours of the best viewing you'll ever get. I can highly recommend that. But one of the great scenes in there is when Gus, he comes riding over the hill with P.I., and they spot a herd of buffalo. And Gus is like, let's go chase those bastards. And P.I.'s like, what? Well, what's the point of that? And Gus is like, because we can, for the joy of it. P.I., he's too dim-witted to try and obtain some joy out of that, so he stays sitting back on his horse, and Gus disappears over the hill chasing buffalo, and then the next scene he comes riding back helter-skelter with 3 arrows in his leg because he ran into a bunch of Comanches. So this is a nice segue back to episode 4.
It take long to get back to the buffalo.
I said we were going to talk about the Lords of the Plains, but anyway,
right off the bat.
Yeah, so here we are. So Gus is riding hell for leather, to get away from the Indians. And of course, this is the start. The clock is ticking now because he's been hit in the leg with arrows, which are broadhead arrow causes a lot of trauma. And the other thing that goes with an arrow wound is bacteria infection. And then, of course, he's a matter of his struggle to survive, and he ends up in a hospital after.
I don't know the story.
Yeah,
Is he the same one that running with the water moccasins, or is that a different
same
character?
movie?
Yeah, same movie, but different character.
Different character. Yeah. Gus is the Texas Ranger. Him and Woodrow Cole.
Yeah,
they're the two that the movie's based on the Goodnight Loving Trail, driving cattle out of Texas. But anyway, back to the arrows in his leg. And it ends up being in this pokey-dink town with a drunk doctor, and he wakes up to already one leg's gone, and because that's all they knew how to do back then. Of course, he's got what they call gas gangrene, and which is a bacterial infection, and the only way they could stop it back then is cut your leg off or your amputation, and before it kills you, right? So the clock is ticking. You only got a couple of days to live. And anyway, the famous scene is he won't let the doctor have his other leg. He says, he pulls out his gun and he's going to shoot the doctor, right? If he tries to take his other leg, he says, my vanity won't allow me, to lose both legs. Old sore bones. So, but gas gangrene, it was so bad, those infections coming from the soil, the bacteria in the soil, and contamination on clothing, any injury that would puncture through your clothing, as example, and it was dirty, and that's why in the Civil War, as example, the American Civil War, there were 660,000, Union and Confederate soldiers died in that war. There's just a huge bloodletting back in 1861 to 65, and out of them there was 60,000 amputations. Of soldiers in the Civil War. They just, stories of piling them up outside the operating tent that was on the battlefield, on the edge of the battlefield, and that was all they knew how to do, was to try and prevent from these injuries where they'd punctured and blasted tissue and clothing. And
the gas gangrene itself might have been more painful too than the actual broad bullet coming in, or
that's where the term "bite the bullet" comes from. You know that?
Like the bullet.
The expression to bite the bullet is to give you something soft, i.e., a ball of lead, to chew down on. Bite as hard as you can so you don't bite your tongue off while they cut your leg off.
Start with the right leg.
Yeah. It's like tough to tell them that's the wrong leg with a big piece of lead in your mouth.
That's where it comes from. Makes sense.
Yeah, as far as I know. I mean, it'd be also kind of impressive if I just made that up on the spot.
Sounds
but
good.
I do believe that it's the expression, like to just bear down and take it. Bite the bullet and get it done with.
But even prior to that point, doesn't it? Well, it's gas gangrene, isn't it?
Yeah,
Kinda
what is
like
this that you're
the
saying?
skin
Gas?
kind of snaps or
Yeah.
crackles a little bit, and it's all underneath the
Gas gangrene is what
gas
you're saying?
gangrene. Yeah,
Oh,
Yeah, like the
But it's-
bacterial toxin releases a gas, and it's
okay.
putrefaction. The stench is apparently horrendous,
yeah.
and then it puffs up the skin, like Tommy said. And
Run your hands along it and kind
Ooh.
of feel the pockets of gas
Of
move
gas.
along it. Yeah.
Is this related to gangrene fever? Is that a disease?
yeah, there's
Or what is
two different
gangrene?
there's several types of gangrene, but it's like a sepsis of the blood, a poisoning of the blood.
Okay.
You could look it up, maybe what the
should, yeah.
actual pathogen is for. Is it a Clostridium?
perfringens or whatever? I think
Perfringens?
that's what it is.
Yeah. Well, anyway, I think you're right.
But it's once it goes septic.
Yeah.
I think it's a progression. It's not all Clostridium would be that, but
Yeah,
if it
sometimes
progresses
it's
enough.
I think a strep form, but
Oh,
either
maybe
way,
a
it's a
strep.
nightmare. But
Mhm.
so we're talking about bacteria, that they couldn't even see in the Civil War. Certainly, Gus back in Lonesome Dove didn't know what the hell bacteria was,
Mhm.
and so when you looked at the wars, the major wars, more soldiers died from infections and disease than they did from combat wounds. Like it was
A lot more.
a lot more. And then as the weaponry advanced, this is the tremendous story that's sort of told in The Demon Under the Microscope, which we recommend people to read, the history of the discovery of antibiotics, which is but I like this issue. I like to think about in these terms that the wounds were a lot cleaner when they were used, like when in Monty Python, when it's just a flesh wound, when he cuts his leg off with a sword, like that's a clean wound.
Yeah.
But when they were being hit by shrapnel and they were in a trench of the Somme or Verdun, when just millions of soldiers died in the filth and the mud and the fecal contamination, and the wounds were totally different then, and that's why more of them died from infections from wounds than they did from actual being killed. And as example, in World War I, there were around 9 million soldiers died in World War I, and I think the combat combat death to disease death was 6-5. So there was more disease death or infections than actual. Then you jump to World War II, when the Germans decided to give it another go, except they're going to do it a little bit bigger, on a bigger scale. And in World War II, is something like 25 million soldiers died. Of course, there's maybe 100 or 200 million civilians, but just in soldiers. And then the ratio had inverted for the first time. Went from one for every 2 combat deaths, there was only 1 disease death. So a huge flip flop, and the difference in that was primarily the discovery and wide use of antibiotics, sulfa and penicillin. Yeah.
It's there's, I think, before diving into that, the numbers are staggering. If it hadn't been invented in time for World War II, how many would have? Do you know how many would have been estimated to die? I know there's figures out there for because the size of that war was much greater, and it might have been times 2 that the number that even was there. I don't know.
Yeah, well, if you took the same ratio from World War I, when there was that 6-5 ratio, more disease infection deaths, then the soldiers' deaths in World War II would have went from 25 million to like 44.5 million.
Yeah, and that's not even factoring in the increase in damage that the weapons do, and maybe even more.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. That's right. That's just keeping the
Same ratio
between. Yeah.
Yeah.
So it was it was an absolute miracle, the advent of and the discovery of in the manufacturing, that we've enjoyed of these miraculous compounds,
right?
That we call antimicrobials or antibiotics, and
yeah.
So
Might be a nice segue into today's topic if we haven't picked up on it by now. I think everyone has some level of familiarity with antibiotics today. And, for health reasons, there's a lot of positive outcomes that come from that. But in general, it seems like connotation as it relates to human health and agriculture and things like that, it might get a little bit of a negative twist. And and so I think we want to maybe try to tackle that, put some positive perspective as far as where the technology has come from and how all the good that it has brought to the world. And so, because I think people even, just a couple of topics today might be people are worried about antibiotic residues ending up in their food, and antibiotic resistance. That's the main negative outcome from overusing antibiotics is the resistance concern. And so I think that message kind of gets in the way of all of the good and all of the lives that are saved from the technology of inventing and discovering antibiotics. And so maybe we want to jump way to the beginning of that to walk it forward to today. But I think in general, that's kind of what we hope to tackle.
Yeah, for sure. Well, I think we've all seen the marketing on chicken or beef. There's never ever beef, never treated with antibiotics. What's the other portion? Oh, the never given growth promotants, but you see it in chicken or poultry too, antibiotic free. So it's everywhere. And I think there's some, we could touch on this, but there's some kind of cheeky marketing around, like the chicken, for example. Am I correct that no chicken is, there's strict rules around antibiotic use in any livestock, but that one in particular, right, is there?
Yeah. So any food that you're eating today is antibiotic free.
Correct.
There's procedures in place and inspections
withdrawal
with
periods.
The FDA and has withdrawal periods with antibiotics that are used in livestock, and then USDA inspects all of the meat that ends up getting sold ends up on our plate. And so everything has been tested. So everything that we are eating, whether it was fed antibiotics to help it recover from an illness during that animal's life or not, technically is all antibiotic free. But it's a clever play on the words.
Well, I think that's good. Just throw that out there to start. That for some general perspective, that piece that all food in our food supply is antibiotic free, thanks to those withdrawal periods and the regulations in place.
Do you think everyone knows what antibiotic resistance is?
No, I don't even. I mean, I do in a really general sense, but no.
What do you think?
I mean, it put me on the spot. I would say it's the losing the efficacy of the antibiotics to fight what they were intended to combat. Is that like they don't work as well as they did when they first started because the organisms that they're targeting are adapting and becoming resistant to that antibiotic.
Right.
Is that correct in a nutshell?
Yeah. Yep. And I think a lot of people have heard, like, Jack Josie is a NICU nurse. She'll be familiar with.
That's my wife for the listeners.
That's Jack's wife for the listeners, but but she'll be familiar with multi-drug resistant, pathogens in a hospital, because hospitals are just they're the nexus point for these real nasty pathogens that have been concentrated there over decades and decades. And so we have a situation where some bacteria, infectious bacteria, were easily killed and put under control by using penicillin, for example, and but they've adapted resistance to it, meaning they've lost their sensitivity or they've developed mechanisms to survive the antibiotics, so the antibiotics don't kill them anymore. And so this is what we call when it's talked about antibiotic resistance, and that's why there's a real fear about it. Tommy, you were talking about some numbers on the deaths of people today from antibiotic resistance, and what were those numbers you were saying?
Yeah, I think the number jumps around depending on where you look, but I think would be in the ballpark of 1 million to 2 million people maybe
globally
at risk of dying from antibiotics that previously would have worked before.
You mean
resistance,
infections
maybe.
that could have
That
been
would have
treated?
yeah.
Yeah.
So it is
not
a
the
real
antibiotic killing them. It's
Right.
that it's losing its ability to combat the infection that
Yeah.
ultimately is.
So this whole topic of antibiotic resistance is is it a legitimate?
Yeah.
It sounds like it. It's a legitimate
Yeah, it's a big
concern and big deal.
deal. It is.
How does that relate to ag though? Is that where the
Yeah.
kind of the gray area is?
Right.
If on one hand we can say, it is a big deal. That's it. Very much it is. But then at the same time, I think I know what we'll talk about today, that it's not something we need to be scared of in the use in agriculture. Is that fair to say, or is there? I mean, that's really simplifying it.
Yeah, I think in general it's fair to say, because there's more things. People are more aware. So we've known about antibiotic resistance and antimicrobial resistance for ever since 2 years after penicillin was discovered. I think resistance had already been discovered with it, and so we've known about this concept for a long time. And you mentioned even under the microscope, the Gerhard Domach, the main character in that book, the one that kind of, I assume we'll get into it at some point, developed the first sulfa drugs. He was aware of this phenomena way back then and was worried about it, and this was the 30s and the 40s. But in general, it seems like we've been maybe a touch slow to jump on how serious it could be to have widespread antibiotic resistance. And so agriculture is a big user of antibiotics, and the way that evolution works, if you say you have this target with the antibiotic, it's really good at attacking that target. But if there's slight mutations within that genus or that species of bacteria, for instance, then that one's able to survive. That one's now able to replicate. And so that one is the new one that you're battling that has a mutation maybe that allows it to withstand the previously efficacious antibiotic. And so now there's a new bacteria pathogen that's out there that needs a new antibiotic maybe to tackle it. And if we're using antibiotics that are meant for humans or that work in humans also in animals, the thought there is that you can increase the rate of this sort of process happening, and then these bugs end up, they can jump, we can pick them up and carry them around the world, and then that ends up being a health concern for humans. I think that's at least how I would describe it. Is that kind of what you think or makes sense?
The World Health Organization, for what it's worth, they're talking that they're projecting that with the way things are going now, by the year 2050, we'll have about maybe 10 million people will be dying a year from infections that we used to be able to treat, but we can't anymore. So it is a big deal, and but there's lots of reason for optimism, and we'll talk about that too. And it's a very complicated issue actually. And that's the beauty of having these chats, because there's so many angles to this damn thing. And so it'll be kind of fun to peel the onion, a little bit. And I would think I just learned a new term, that's a new term. It's called a Schelling point. This week I was reading about it. Schelling points. Have you heard of Schelling points?
No.
Mm-mm.
Well, Schelling points are like, if you ask people, say just the three of us, there's a prize, right? We get, a case of Busch Light. If we can guess, and there's 4 squares to choose from, 1, 2, 3, 4. But we only get the case of Busch Light, if we all guess the same square. And so they're all white squares, except for one is blue. Well, a Schelling point is the coalition. The non-communicated agreement on what we'll be attracted to. So we'll all choose the blue, because in your mind you can sort out why it's a better chance that we'll all be attracted to that.
Is it behind there?
It's called a Schelling point. What's that?
Did
Is
we get
the bush
the beer?
behind it? Did we
The
win?
bush is behind. Hence the blue.
Podcast over. We got the beer.
Yeah. Anyway, so that I thought, well, that's kind of a cool phenomenon. And then I was thinking about it just now while you're talking about, I think a little bit of the Schelling point is with antibiotic resistance, and the blue square is animal agriculture. Has become Like
thing.
if you
Yeah.
search on Google for antibiotic resistance, like I've been doing, as I do a lot of reading on it and whatever, but it's overwhelmingly the feed that you get from all the search engines is around animal agriculture, farming, causing antibiotic resistance.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a shelling point, whereas there are many factors that we could talk about. One is human, misuse of antibiotics.
Mm-hmm.
Another is that antibiotics antibiotics have resistance to almost all known man-made antibiotics. Bacteria have resistance naturally as part of their immune system.
Another one would be
And,
the people Googling these answers have their dog or cat sitting right there on their lap, Maybe
Right.
that dog has been into the vet 6 times already that week.
Yeah.
And that's getting dosed with antibiotics.
Yeah. Companion animals.
Mm-hmm.
There's, I don't know, in the U.S., I think we have 70 million cats and dogs, with 330 million people. And cats and dogs are great reservoirs of antibiotic-resistant genes. And to your point, Tommy, dogs are licking, our kids' faces. We live with the damn things, so we're sharing a lot of this together.
Mm-hmm.
So there's another good one. And so there's many ways that we're, how do you say? There's many culprits in this.
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
Yeah.
Everyone's
So-
focusing on
But the
the blue square.
right, which is ag.
Yep.
So
And,
But
so
it's a complete non-starter to not acknowledge that it. Yeah. So I think that back to your question in a way, is it a concern and is it
Yeah.
something we should be thinking about? And the answer there is for sure yes.
Sure.
It's just now where can we make meaningful, impacts on the next 50 years or 30 years as we get to 2050? Is it going to end up being 10 million deaths because of this, or what are the practical steps we can take to maybe mitigate that?
Can we back up just for a minute, just for my sake, to how long have we been using antibiotics intentionally? Like the
Right.
manufactured sulfa drugs. Like, what does this timetable look like?
If you're a fan of big monumental landmarks, it'd be between World War I and II.
Oh, yeah, we did talk about that. Okay.
But the specific penicillin was at 1928, Dad?
Yeah, Alexander Fleming, the Scottish.
Okay, so we haven't
physician.
we haven't had 100 years even of
No.
adoption of these.
Depends what you consider actually using it, though. If you look back, I don't know, I think it's 2,000 to 3,000. Well, is 1500 BC? Is that that's over 3,000 years ago, right?
Yeah,
Yeah,
that's-
500.
So
Right.
they're putting moldy bread and rubbing these, I think they call them special soils, dirt that had these, and now we know today they would have been carrying these, beneficial bacteria in them, but they had the mold in the bread would be the fungi, and then the soils would have the mixture of the microbiomes. They knew about rubbing those on their wounds.
Really?
3,000 years ago, there's documentation of humans doing that.
Where
Wow.
was this
And
happening?
so that's a good question. I don't know. Where were people 3,000 years
In
ago?
the
Egypt
Middle
and-
East,
Yeah.
the Fertile
Fertile
Crescent.
Crescent, yeah. Wow,
Yeah.
that's
Yeah. And the
So-
Chinese have got a 3,000-year history of,
Mm-hmm.
herbal, medicinal, alchemy, that you couldn't understand because we couldn't see the chemistry. They did,
Yeah.
but they
We
knew,
just knew it worked.
trial and error, right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
getting down to what actually is causing, or what's the helpful agent in that, they didn't know until 1928, maybe. Let's
but they
just
knew
say
there
that.
was something there.
For a long time,
adopted.
we've had the association of this thing here contained the bacteria that we now know about today, and so
Would that be I'm leading us maybe astray, but is that kind of the root of this, herbal medicines or plant medicines that, of course, appeared all throughout history, was that they were just very rudimentary
Mm-hmm.
forms, and you kind of, a lot of error involved,
Mhm.
but there was something scientific to a lot of these treatments, but they maybe didn't know the active
Sure.
ingredient like you were talking about.
Yep. yeah, it could be. I mean, that would be one possible thing for sure that could come from that. But plants and different Fungi would be another example that have been used a lot for different human purposes, but they have different compounds for sure in them that can elicit positive health impacts that apart from the microbiome. And but I think that would be probably pretty fair to say that.
Well, the classic is the salicylic acid from willow bark, that's the base compound for aspirin. And
there you go.
that was discovered by many cultures separately of each other, in history. So for maybe thousands of years in South America, and I mean it's been discovered independently for pain medications, and of course opium. Opiates have been used
How many
widely.
pieces of bark do you try before you get the positive effect?
Well, that's right. I don't know.
With all of this stuff.
It's tremendous.
So much
really.
trial and error.
It's got to be like so weak in comparison to refined aspirin. You have to eat like an entire tree's worth of bark.
You have to be so observant. You have to have someone that in your group that stays alive to to witness all these different
who's the low man
approaches.
I'm curious about the fungi experiments. Like those are it's not like exactly to be trifled with.
They shamans, the shaman tradition was a healing and spiritual health of the community or the tribe, but they carried unbelievable knowledge, non-written knowledge, obviously, about herbs and plants, and all passed on for eons. So there's a lot of base knowledge there, but none of it was like. It couldn't be understood mechanistically, until very recently. So, and then the other thing is the good news couldn't be shared very widely because, I mean, how far can your fastest horse run? It's like, I think I discovered something good in the willow bark. It's like, I can share the news with within a radius of 30 miles. I mean, it's not, nothing could travel far.
Yeah.
But, no,
Just
it's been.
Quick side note on that. I'm reading a book with Kit Carson in it, and he gave himself 60 days to make it from California back east, and he thought he could do it. And so he was maybe the fastest of the bunch, though. So 60 days to get the word back to. He got caught up and didn't end up making it, but that he thought was doable.
On horseback?
Yeah. But today, obviously, that's a second. You fire off a message, and you've got information.
Yeah.
But 60 days was fast.
What is that book called? Because
Blood and Thunder.
Oh yeah, I read that.
The
That's
Navajos.
Brilliant.
And
yeah, here we are back to the favorite subject.
Yeah, can you tell what is a captivating subject
here's
matter?
some just to put in perspective, because sometimes we live with in today's world we have such affluence and we have such health. And it happened so recently, but in the context of humanity, we're living in a very, very rarefied atmosphere, of tremendous health and economy. But the history of mankind has been abject, horror when it comes to disease, both viruses and bacteria, infectious disease, and they had no idea where it was coming from. And in fact, the widespread belief across everyone, whether you were in, I guess in the plains, the savanna of Africa, or in the Middle East, or here in North America, was there's something wrong with the ear, miasma they called it, or there was an imbalance in the body. They call the four humors, between your blood and fluids, and they had these, so they had these sort of what we look on as being like crazy, sort of witchcrafty, bullshit theories. But they couldn't see bacteria. They didn't know what they were, and they sure as shit couldn't see viruses. So they had no idea of what was attacking them, and so hence, the usual remedy was when smallpox would hit, or the Black Plague. It's like, take the virgin to the mountain and throw her in the volcano, because if that doesn't work, ground up 3 more and take them up there and throw them in. Or it's like, eye of bat, wing of bat, eye of newt, and stir it in with a chicken bone. You know, and then
I've heard that one.
I heard
actually
that one
does
does work. Yeah,
that one works.
we tried it that one time. It made me feel a lot
That
better.
one actually is pretty good.
Yeah,
So
but
they
the
were onto
others, I get
something.
it.
It took care of pneumonia.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No,
It's good perspective though, because there's a lot of
Well, how
people
many
like to get caught up in
Right.
the bad things that are going on in the world. But would you like to get sick today? You know, you're more than likely going to recover. But back in the 1600s with the four humors, the yellow bile, the black bile, blood, and I'm forgetting, phlegm. You choose one depending on the season. So it was seasonal, and they'd say it's blood in the spring. They'd bleed you. They think you're at an imbalance, and
Is that
I
where
think that's going
leeches
to work.
Came in.
That's off that same thought process. I think those are supposed to
Or is that
pull the
bloodletting?
blood and
Like,
cleanse you through that. But I don't know what
what is
this was like-
bloodletting? Is that what this is? Where they
this was like Hippocrates, and so it was. I think it was widespread that these four humors and were to keep you in balance.
blood? Are you
that was
familiar
like
with
2,000 years they practiced this. I don't know. Is that the
bloodletting? Yeah, that's. I'm
the
just like.
leeches?
Well, no, bloodletting is the withdrawal of blood from a patient
Yeah.
to prevent or cure illness.
open
and
up a vein.
disease.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You know, as
or by
recently as
leeches, yep.
1799, how many years ago is that? That's like 100. And George Washington,
This is
first president
Yeah.
of the U.S. They drained 40% of his blood out on his deathbed. They couldn't figure out why he died from the time he had a scratchy throat, and he died 2 days later, and they couldn't figure out why he died so damn quickly.
Wow.
They induced vomiting in him. They burned him. They burned his feet and his legs to create blisters.
You're just so much better off not getting medical
And
care.
then they opened up his veins 5 times and took 40% of his blood.
Oh my gosh.
It's like this, and he had the 3 best physicians in the world attending him.
Most
They're
creative.
shocked when it didn't work.
And they're like, "What the hell happened, Jimmy?"
that
like-
one works like 10% of the time.
Yeah, normally he should be up riding his horse. I mean,
How is there any with these? They seem so crazy now. Obviously, is the point you're trying to make. But actually, though, how is there any degree of success that they thought it would be a good idea to like that they caught on to that
They
bloodletting is an actual practice?
yeah.
You'd think
Maybe
it would
the
have to just make things
placebo
work.
effect is super strong. You
I-
think
I-
you're at the right hands.
Well,
of
and
treatment
I did read that if you let out a lot of people's blood, they lose a lot of oxygen. They sort of have a hypoxia, which sometimes can be accompanied by a euphoric feeling.
Oh,
It's like you're losing, and so the patient would say, "Oh, I feel better,"
Yeah, there
because
it is.
he's in this really
low oxygen.
low oxygen to his brain and has sort of a flush feeling, and so
Wow.
they're like, "Oh yeah, if a little bit of bloodletting works, then probably a lot
How's
is going to be a
40%?
lot better."
Talk about exponential though. For 2,000 years up through George
Yeah.
Washington, that was how you fixed yourself if you got sick. And
Well, even
now
later. I mean,
today
we're
we've
talking about
had-
Washington, but I'm looking at a photo here in 1860. We were still doing it.
That's the Civil War.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
So yeah,
Mm.
Washington for sure, but even 100 years.
Well, and a lot of
Later
you
than
think
that.
how many witches got burned
Yeah.
because the plague came through the village.
Mhm.
It's like I saw her picking dandelions and underneath a hickory tree, and a crow landed in the tree above her. They're like, burn her.
Build a bridge out of her.
Yeah. They're like, what is it? The ducks.
Yeah.
floating,
She
yeah.
weighs more than a.
She weighs more.
What
than
else
a
floats?
Floats a duck.
duck. Yeah. Who are you so wise in the ways of science? It's like perfect.
Yeah.
So I
Lift
was
this thing
I was
up.
reading to put it in perspective, like all the way up to 1900. So let's say for thousands and thousands of years, tens of thousands of years, people only lived to 25 to 35 years of age. That's all you could do, because of infectious disease and injuries, which cause disease infections, and even in during right up to 1990, a quarter of the infants died in their first year of life, and half of all children died before puberty.
In 1990?
Right up till 1990. So, and in it's right up over the late 1800s. So, half of your
Are you saying
children.
1890 or 30 years ago, or
Like in our lifetime? Kids
No,
were
no.
dying at that rate?
No,
Okay,
no.
1890.
1890,
18, okay.
1900.
I was gonna say that's
That-
like
Yeah.
during like the
Yeah,
Clinton
in
administration.
1900 in the U.S., 30% of all deaths were children under the
That
age of
makes more
5.
sense.
Yeah.
So
Yep.
it was really terrible.
Yeah.
Oof.
I mean, that's been the biggest. There's a lot of reasons why the average age today is, steadily increasing, and it's made huge strides. But the child mortality and infant mortality numbers are way, way down.
Yeah. Now we're like 0.4%.
Yeah.
Just hardly ever. I mean, it's so tragic, but it's we've made such strides in that area. So that's why our life expectancy. So we went from 25 to 35 years of age. Now we're about 78, 80 years of age.
Yeah.
And our population, the world population, went from, in 1927, I think was when we had our second billion. We had 2 billion people in 1927. When Gerard Domack was experimenting to develop the first antibiotic, and today we have 8 billion. 6 billion more people on the planet, and our average life expectancy is 40 years more.
Yeah.
It's miraculous. The advent of our understanding of disease.
Right. Well,
So,
and his invention is one of his discovery. I don't know if I guess it's an invention. They
Yeah.
came up.
Who is
They
this?
created it. Gerhard Domack, the
Okay.
German scientist that. Well, he worked for, I don't know if it's in the book that we referenced earlier, The Demon Under the Microscope. It's a fantastic book that walks through the discovery of sulfa drugs. And so,
What are sulfa drugs?
it's the drug that's sulfanilamide is the compound. And then these original ones, they tied, so in Germany, they had these big dye manufacturing companies for staining clothes and wools, different colors, and that was a huge industry. And so they knew to attach sulfa to the dye at one point, and it would have different properties that stuck out. And so through this elaborate process of, not necessarily elaborate as far as intentional, but he tested maybe 1,000 molecules, just one after another, putting them into mice to see which ones worked and which ones didn't. So say he got a little positive effect with this one combination. He'd then go to his chemist and have him tweak one little atom on it and test that one again, and then they just carry on like that. But that's kind of the first.
The mice were all
antibiotic.
infected with strep.
Yes.
Okay.
Like a terrible strep that killed 100% of the mice.
Yep.
Then one day he came back from holiday or whatever, and they
Christmas of 1932.
Yeah, and they had one compound
Really?
on the shelf that they hadn't used, and I think his lab assistant threw it in because he had a set of mice, and he's like, "Well, try it." And the damnedest thing, the mice were all alive. Every other mouse was dead, and this one group was alive, and that was the eureka moment. It's like,
Wow.
God damn.
Mm-hmm.
It's like a scene out of I Am Legend. Have you seen that?
Yeah.
When he-
yeah.
I mean, it's actually almost
Came up.
exactly the same with the mice or the rats, but
Yes.
came back, and
Right.
that's
It's
interesting.
the same thing. Some of these great researchers need to go on holiday because Fleming did the same thing. He came back, and the story is he had dropped some mold out of his lab coat pocket into the Petri dish. And he came back from holiday 2 weeks later and was walking by, and he looked at the Petri dish, and he saw all the bacteria growth was a perimeter of the Petri dish away from this nucleus of a mold that was sitting in the middle. And they say a discovery is the meeting of a prepared mind with an accident, right? That's our discovery.
Yeah.
So he had a prepared mind. He'd been working on this. He walked by it, and he's like, "Bugger me." All the frickin' bacteria are staying away, as far away on the perimeter of the Petri dish from the mold.
Yep.
And so holidays are important.
That's the takeaway.
But so there's the two biggies. Sulfa was the first antibiotic really ever identified, and after they isolated it, and then they scaled up how to make it industrial manufacturing because the Germans were the leaders in industrial chemical processes, and then they were able to use that in World War II. Every soldier carried a white packet, pouches of sulfur.
Just a quick comment on that. I know you just watched this too, but Band of Brothers, if we're wondering how historically accurate that is,
sure.
There's reference to sulfur
Really?
throughout that.
Yeah, that's what they rip
dump
open and dump it on
the white powder
Yeah.
on the open wound, and the medic's carrying it around, and he's asking for people for their sulfur.
That's what
And
they're
so,
doing.
Yeah.
Okay, it was like life. It makes a lot of
Tran-
sense now knowing that, because it was a
Those
dramatic thing
wounds
to get
prior
more
to the-
sulfur.
Right, and those wounds prior to the sulfur is what ends up being what can progress to cutting old sawbones procedures.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah, so every soldier carried packets of sulfur, and every medic carried like kilos of it.
Mm-hmm.
And then I think the Americans they were able to ramp up penicillin in like 1943, so halfway through the Second World War, and then it became it's a broader spectrum use, and then penicillins took off, to be used, of course, worldwide.
Around that,
as
shortly
the first
after that,
choice.
maybe around what time? The 50s?
1943. They were
Okay.
first commercially used, and then
And then immediately after that.
oh
basically.
yeah, just everyone started
Yeah.
producing them.
How do you, without going into crazy detail,
Mhm.
it might be, maybe it's just me that would be interested, but how do you actually produce these? Like, what does that process look like? I know we talked about the nitrogen. I know they're not related, but maybe it's a recurring question I'm going to have, is how are these things actually manufactured? But
Right.
to take that, the science works, but then to adopt it on a mass commercial scale.
Yeah.
Do you have any knowledge on how that would have happened?
Yeah, Tommy maybe knows too, but on penicillin, that's called I know that they have different modes of action. So the sulfur they found it's a long story actually. The dye wasn't useful. That's kind of irony, because they did it because they were dye manufacturers. And then after thousands of experiments, they're like, hold on, we actually don't need the dye. We just need the sulfur.
But the French beat them to it, actually.
Yeah, right. The Pasteur Institute discovered it first. But it's like all their money was tied up in the dye piece of it. Anyone could make a sulfur molecule through chemical manipulation. I don't know how they do it,
Sure.
Jack, but in a lab, just on a bench top, I guess you can put together the sulfur,
Yeah.
this ring that they,
Yep.
a special, which the sulfur was the key active. And the way it killed bacteria is it starved them by sort of exclusion or blocking the uptake of I'm not an expert, but it blocked folic acid, which the bacteria need to survive, and they couldn't synthesize folic acid, and so it killed them by an indirect route, if you will, by starving them of an essential nutrient, folic acid.
Yeah.
Wow.
Penicillin's different mode of action, like you mentioned. That one targets the cell wall. And so there's gram-negative and gram-positive bacteria, and they differ based off of this thing called a peptidoglycan layer. They're thick versus thin. And so the penicillin's able to inhibit the peptidoglycan layer from forming, and therefore the cells end up leaking and become fragile and end up being more susceptible to, the antibiotic that can actually kill them. And so I think it's a good point that antibiotics, it's not just a one thing.
Sure.
They don't have one mode of action. And so that's why some are more efficacious for certain things and some work better in other scenarios, but
Some
their
are
mode of
more
action
general, some are more-
differ quite widely.
Okay.
Yeah.
So we're 1943, around then is when we say it's kind of mass adopted by humans. When did it make its way into agriculture? Was it basically the same as soon as we realized it worked in people, we realized we can start applying it to livestock?
I think so, Jack. Once they scaled up these factories everywhere, and I think on penicillin, you asked how they make it. I think penicillin's primarily made by fermentation.
Yeah.
Process to grow these molds, but in a huge vats,
Sure.
So they scaled up in the war. The war drove
Needed a lot.
scaling up because you needed it by the gazillions. And so now you had all the factories scaled up and all the knowledge, there were no patents worth a damn. Everything was shared all around the world. So they started making it, and every continent was making sulfur and penicillin. Within 10 years of the discovery of sulfur drugs, there was already 5,400 derivatives, of that compound that had been made. So it just exploded, and it was called the miracle drug. Like, there's two famous events that also made it huge that I think maybe are interesting. One of them was FDR Jr. It was Franklin Delano Roosevelt. His son had I have to think about it. Did he have a sore throat?
So he had strep.
He had strep throat.
Yep.
And he was dying. And this was when sulfur was still sort of speculative. The world didn't really know that it was the real deal.
Yep.
And they everything else failed. He was dying just from strep throat. You can imagine it.
Mm-hmm.
He was like 21 years of age. He was engaged to be married next week anyway. And so they rushed in some Protonsil, which is the sulfur drug, and they loaded him up on it, and miraculously it saved his life.
Wow.
And then another one was Winston Churchill.
Yeah.
He'd been meeting with Stalin, the Allied powers, Stalin and FDR in Iran in 1943. Churchill got pneumonia in Egypt, and he was deathly sick. I mean, the war could have had a different outcome, if Churchill had died there. And they loaded him up on sulfur, and he credits that to saving his life. Like 2 days later, he was good to go.
Wow.
Back to smoking cigars,
Either that
drinking
or
cognac.
Yeah, with pneumonia.
Yeah, right.
The cigar doesn't fix it. The sulfur will.
And if that doesn't, the bloodletting.
Yeah,
But
it's getting
started.
yellow bile out of it.
Yeah, and you
Wow,
can imagine
that's-
it went around the world,
Yeah.
both of these events.
But
you
even
know.
to back up on the iconic nature of how bad these things can go, or how well these are a positive outcome. But Calvin Coolidge, I think, was the example prior to that, where his son.
Who the hell's Calvin Coolidge?
Isn't that the president?
No, I think that's right.
What?
I think
You're
President from the 1800s.
Come on, you gotta be
hilarious.
kidding me.
I don't know any more about him, but I know this little bit about
He's
his
got
son.
doesn't he have like a lot of bowling trophies?
Sounds right.
the Big Lebowski.
Oh yeah,
Yeah.
that's the dude abides.
For
Man.
the record, I'm pretty sure you know who Calvin Coolidge is. But you do put a good point that I don't think if anyone out there can name one thing that he did in his
Right.
term as president without Googling it.
I know he had a kid that died, and that's where I'm heading.
Okay,
Yeah, well, you don't get that
okay.
answer.
All right, tell us. This better be a good death, too.
Yeah, it is a good one. His kid was playing tennis and just got a blister on his foot. I think we've all had blisters, and ended up getting strep infected into the blister, and then his son died a week later. This was prior to
Weak.
antibiotics. So yeah, weak
Weak.
That's from tennis.
from tennis,
From
a
a
blister.
blister.
Yeah, I know. But it sounds
Tennis didn't.
sounds
I don't think tennis did him in. I think it was the blister.
cause of death listed
That's a
on
good
the
listener, though.
moral of that story.
Don't
Stick to
play
pickleball.
Oh, that's
Yeah.
funny.
Yeah.
But yeah, like a boil, acne would damn near kill you, I mean, it did. It's just unreal how many people died from infectious disease. Did you know that we're so lucky to be here, we're descendants of Europe, coming through New Zealand or coming through America, European descendants. But the bubonic plague, that was a bacteria, Yersinia pestis, I think.
It was like a Harry Potter thing.
it does.
Right.
Pretty sure that's Harry Potter.
Right. But the bubonic plague, terrorized Europe for centuries, killed 100 million people, just unbelievable. Carried on a rat,
Yeah.
the flea. Then it would bite people and spread the bacteria like that.
Was that one known pretty quickly? What was carrying it? Obviously not the flea part, but the
rats.
flea was known too. But did people know pretty early on into this that it was the rats, or did that take years and years of observation?
Right. No, they didn't put that together. There's another great book called Justinian's Flea. It's the fall of the Roman Empire in the east out of Constantinople, which is today is Istanbul. but that's where it originated out of there, out of Turkey, and then it traveled on all the trading ships up the Mediterranean and killed millions of people on the way. Every port it stopped at, in Carthage and in Italy and up into Venice and south of France, and spread it all around the continent. And
The flea.
the flea,
Wow.
traveling on boats. The rats were famous on boats. They traveled with everyone, and they spread it. And so we're damn lucky to be here. Between that and smallpox killed up to 500 million people in Europe in the 19th, I think, century. 500 million over a century, but still. Hell, there was hardly any people
I was going to
back
say
then.
there was 500 million there to kill.
Yeah. And that's
that one
another
has a cool
bacteria
story too about the inoculation. How that, I can't remember his name. Do you know his name? The guy that connected it to the
smallpox
cowpox?
is a virus, though. I got to clear that. Variola virus, but yeah, infectious as hell.
Yeah, but the connection to the cowpox.
Yeah,
No,
Edward Jenner.
Yeah. That's right.
Tell that. His milkmaids are in this. I like to hear about milkmaids.
Gets us to Leeuwenhoek. Yeah.
Buxom milkmaids. No, really, they were known. They were known, and they fantasized about them because they had beautiful complexion.
Oh, really?
Milkmaids. Yeah, because smallpox, of course, the trademark of anyone who survived it, well, hardly anyone survived, but because it killed like 80%. People died in 3 days. It's like Bring Out Your Dead.
Yeah.
They're running around with the cat.
Yeah.
But they were scarred for life with pox, blistered scar tissue on their faces, but the milkmaids had these beautiful virginal faces.
I feel like we jumped ahead, Tommy. How is milkmaid connected to good skin, connected to not dying from smallpox?
Yeah. You didn't follow?
No, I didn't. But if I had to guess,
together.
something about the milk or the cow helped them out.
Yeah, that's right. I think
Very clever.
Yes.
Look at me.
Jenner had identified that people that
Girls.
had exposure, these milkmaids in particular, kids or anything that had been exposed to cattle or had the cowpox was a slight variation from smallpox, right? So that kind of
cowpox is on the udder, on the teats of the cow.
Okay.
So they would milk the cow. The milkmaids milk the cows every day, and they would get a mild infection from the cow's version of this virus blistering, but it rendered them 100% immune to the smallpox. So
yeah, so maybe he wasn't the first to identify that phenomena, but he inoculated kids with cowpox because I think kids were even more susceptible. They had a really, really high death rate.
Wow.
And that solved it.
Almost like
That's a vaccine, though.
And that's where the name vaccine. But that's where the name vaccine comes from. Cow. In Latin,
oh, sure.
Vaca. Vaccine.
Wow.
There we go.
I know
that.
I know. Well, that's it. And it was just like staggering how many billions of lives have been saved.
How would he inoculate the kids in this? Because what time period are we talking about?
Jenner's in
17?
I mean, rough. Okay, so would he just,
1700.
rudimentally get them sick?
He scratched them on it.
Okay.
He opened a wound on their arm, and then he would put some of the pustules from the cowpox into the wound.
It was very manually. Very contact.
Yeah.
Kind of a
Nothing really.
crude method.
Yeah, crude early vaccine, but effective.
But it worked.
Yeah.
Wow.
And
That's interesting.
and then it started from there, and then and today, there's I think they adapted it. There's a famous story around the bifurcated needle. I think it's Jonas Salk who invented the polio vaccine.
Mm-hmm.
You could Google that, but there was a famous invention of this bifurcated needle with the two, like goalposts, and it holds the droplet between them and allows you to scratch. And that they took these needles all around the world, and the needle is a big part of the success story too, because it allowed them to administer it to thousands of people a day, an accurate dose, and efficiently.
Wow.
So there's
I don't know that.
yeah. No, it's an amazing innovation and that's how they did it. Vaccination of certain vaccines have to be done like that, or were done like that. So yeah, anyway, there was a mysterious world that, humanity lived through that today, we got access to all this knowledge, and we're sort of blind to how lucky we are, and how frickin'
take it for granted.
Literally, they were in the dark, and tragedy was, every, tragedy within your family. Half your family died, mothers died. It's like in Paris in the 1700s, something like 40% of all women, that died in childbirth in one of Paris's biggest hospitals. And they had no idea why. But the doctors were infecting each mother as they examined them. Dirty hands.
Yep.
They never washed.
Yep.
And they were spreading this, terrible strep bacteria from one mother to the other. And it was the biggest hospital in Europe, I think, in Paris. 40% of all the mothers who went in there died. It's just horrendous.
I think the mothers knew this too, but I think at that time it was known that they were in general safer to try to have the give birth at home or not going into the hospital, but the care that was provided, and they'd get kind of the help if they went in there. They rolled the dice and decided that some places maybe it was 10%, some places it was 40%. Those odds are really pretty poor. But they'd still roll the dice to get a couple of weeks of
how bad must it be outside if that's what you decide to do?
Yeah, whoa.
It's like your life must really suck. If I'm so bad, I want to go in and have a rest.
Yeah, yeah.
I'm willing to take the odds.
60% chance.
Yeah, but that childbed fever, right? Is that what it was?
Yeah, childbed fever. That's exactly it. So it was unbelievable. So having babies was a terribly, terribly dangerous activity. For so long, so, and they had no idea what was killing people. So, back to young women in volcanoes, because they had no idea. It wasn't until they first saw bacteria in 1600s, late 1600s, Antony Leeuwenhoek, a Dutch fabrics guy, actually. He was into textiles, but he had a hobby of shining glass, and he developed the first microscope to look at bacteria.
You have that hobby.
It's a hilarious hobby.
But thank God for such an esoteric hobby,
I get it, but it's so funny to.
I know, it's
what's your hobby?
What are you doing?
Glass.
I like to go hunting. What do you like to do?
Shine glass.
Shine glass.
I like to play tennis. No, actually, I'm
careful with that.
too busy shining my glass. But no, he's a great polisher of glass.
Oh, polish. I thought you meant like shining lights through glasses.
Well, he did that too. He put a light behind it.
That's where it began.
But then he opened up the whole universe. Like no one knew it existed. Microorganisms. The biggest thing they'd been able to see
I think I
before
glazed
then.
over it, but he invented the microscope.
He did. He invented the first microscopes, and prior to that, the biggest thing they'd ever seen was like mice shit. And then he was able to look at everything he looked at. He looked at hair on his head. He looked at fruit, food, everything he would look at.
What else?
There is a sordid story where he actually looked. He was very fond of looking at his own sperm underneath him in a microscope and watch those little bastards swimming around. Yeah. And apparently, so polishing glass wasn't the only thing he liked to polish. Oh, God. But no. But seriously. So then he was being invited to all the royal courts. Like he discovered a universe, bacteria, protozoa, and it was everywhere. Like he would challenge them. You give me anything to look at, and then he'd let them look at. It's bacteria on everything. Yeah. And they didn't know what to call it, so he called it animalcules, small animals, animalcules. Today we call them, microbes.
Oh, insane that would have had to be.
Oh, I know.
Like,
it's like when he's looking on his glass, he's like, whoa.
Your perspective would just be similar, like in the opposite direction of like looking through a telescope at the night sky and
Well, exactly.
seeing that,
Right.
whoa.
For the first time, it's like,
but the
whoa.
opposite,
Equally eye-opening.
Right.
Yeah, you
Make
have
you
no idea.
question everything you've
Yeah.
ever thought.
So that was the
This one's
first
almost
time.
even weird though. You
Yeah,
look
this is
down and
weird,
it's like
true.
crawling on your finger
Everywhere.
It's just like you would have no idea.
Yeah.
That's, wow.
Yeah, so he looked at, pond water. Well, anyway, now that, the pennies started dropping, now they're like, first time they're able to figure it out. Oh, maybe it's not the miasma of the air. Maybe it's not the local witch. Maybe it's not the, eye of newt, wing of bat. And they're able to figure it out and then more people got involved and they started to understand that these microbes appear to be living with us healthily because they're in everything. Our teardrops on our hands. Healthy people are covered in these damn things. So it's not, but then they're also able to find that these huge concentrations of abnormal ones in wounds and as example. And then they started figuring it out that these things are a what do you call it? Jekyll and Hyde. Yeah, they're not all good and they're not all bad, but when the bad ones they're killers.
Yep.
Yep. And that was so it was a huge. It put science onto a whole new trajectory. That first revelation of seeing these little buggers.
Like
you know,
kind of that led to Lister.
Yeah.
I mean, he was, if I understand correctly, prior to the discovery and development of sulfa drugs, but he was on to this childbed fever. He was, disinfecting
telling doctors to wash their hands.
Yeah, using antiseptics to cleanse everything, and he was able to start seeing his numbers drop.
Yeah.
In the hospitals that his methods were being implemented in, surgical equipment was clean and everything was being.
Yeah.
Yeah.
He was able to. That's right. It was a huge breakthrough. And we have today Listerine,
right?
As a disinfectant, mouthwash, whatever.
You can start connecting the dots.
Yeah.
So
The dots,
you get the microscope to see what it is, and then you've got this idea that okay, maybe killing some of those sees as a positive in health outcomes, and now it's connecting what about the bacteria is doing the damage.
Yeah.
How do you
No,
stop that?
absolutely. That was kind of in a broad canvas. Those are the steps, of epoch sort of discoveries and breakthroughs, right? Different eras. And then we come to the era of antibiotics. They called it the golden era. So now we're back to post-World War II. We traveled a long way. So Justinian's Flea was like 540 years after Christ was born, and now we're up to post-World War II. Huge jump in time. But now they called it the golden era because we were able to treat damn near any disease on the planet, and health, boomed. So it looked like we were on Halley's Comet. We were on this thing to have a tremendous ride. We got rid of polio, through vaccines. Got rid of smallpox has been eradicated from the world. That's just one of the most amazing vaccination stories. It was the biggest killer mankind's ever known, and we got rid of it completely.
Wow.
It only exists in 2 labs in Russia and the U.S.
What's the benefit of keeping it around?
Well, that's a very good question. It's so frickin' lethal, It's a very good question, Jack. But there are two strains of smallpox that are kept in the highest bio-level labs in the world.
Seems like both should just agree to throw it away at the same time.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, because we have no immunity to it
away.
anymore,
Right.
It's like, wow.
Yeah.
That's interesting.
Well, it is. So we got rid of that, and then the captain of death was pneumonia, so called because once you started coughing and tuberculosis, we got all that. We got, diphtheria, cholera, which is fecal contamination of water through disinfection and water sanitation, and And then all these amazing antibiotics, we were just like spitting them out, one after the other.
And this
derivatives.
was before FDA.
Sure.
So it was really anything could flood the market, and and the claims on them were, for the most part, this was, like you mentioned, a miracle drug, and so they had really lofty claims too on what it could do, and people there's stories of, it had some success with gonorrhea or something like that, and so there's people, would take a couple sulfa pills before they'd go out on the town for the night, and just like it was a recreational, over-the-counter sort of drug, and
free for all.
Yeah.
With no thought that
a lot of countries in the world today, you still can have that. They're all pretty much all drugs are still over the counter in lots of developing countries.
Yeah.
Which is one of the things we come back to on resistance. But so everything, it looked like we really had this thing. We had what do you say? We had it
figured out.
We had it figured out, man.
Can't go wrong.
Right. But just quietly, the resistance to all these pathogens had started to evolve.
Yeah.
So you started seeing less and less, killing ability from the antibiotics in particular. Vaccines are still very effective, but antibiotics, no.
When do you think, like, how long after this mass adoption did it take for people to start noticing? Not even that it started happening, but to start taking note that, this isn't as effective as it once was.
I don't know the exact time point, but it had been quick that it was starting to be identified. And for instance, there hasn't been a new antibiotic that's clinically available since, I think, 1975.
Okay.
So it's
between that golden era
done
and when they started to realize it was a pretty short window.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah. And it could have been, I don't know if there's a specific turning point, but for the golden age or the golden years, the 40s to the 60s, it was widespread, huge amount of usage, stemming from that FDR Jr. story. There was one thing that stopped it, which is actually interesting. Do you remember hearing about the elixir sulfa drug that made it to the market?
Yeah.
And it had something glycerol in it. I can't remember what it was. Some compound. You could look it up if you don't mind, Jack.
It's like antifreeze
sulfa
that we use in our cars today. Antifreeze.
Yeah. It was that dressed up with some raspberry flavorings, and it contained the sulfa. But its title was elixir something. So it sounded really good, but it killed, I don't know, 130
more than 100
people, something. And
it says that it was a improperly prepared sulfonamide antibiotic that caused mass poisoning in the United States in 1937.
Yeah, so 1936, I think, was the FDR Jr. thing, and then 1937 was this, and then it just stopped. And then it really picked back up again once people identified that it wasn't the sulfa component that did the damage.
It was the carrier.
Yeah, right. Because that's what differentiated that product.
Yeah.
Man.
The chemist ended up killing himself. And he was denying it forever that he was guilty, and it obviously weighed on him. But
for sure, he didn't. It was an innocent mistake.
Yeah, everyone was bringing new compounds to the market, and
so that sort of ushered in the FDA.
Think back to those days; they weren't even doing animal testing. They might not even do in vitro testing. They might have done zero testing.
Just give it a
on
go.
This drug.
Right.
Seems like they did zero testing with this one.
It's like you have a meeting, and it's like, I have a good hunch that this will work. So they're like, all right, put it out in the market.
Yeah. Put a raspberry flavor in it.
Yeah. Oh, you're a genius, Jack. Put raspberry in it. Did you hear what he said? You're the head of product development.
Thank you. Just no responsibility though in it.
But you couldn't. The point is, it looked like you couldn't go wrong.
Yeah.
And they kept. But once they identified the central structure of these penicillin sulfur, then they were able to add like hundreds and hundreds of slight changes to it. So they were able to stay ahead of the resistance of the bacteria. They already had seen it within 2 years. Penicillin, they'd seen widespread resistance to it in hospitals and treating soldiers in the battlefields even. But they were able to come with a new derivative, like I'm not a doctor or whatever, but let's say they came with ampicillin, then they come with amoxicillin, and then doxycyllin, and they're all slightly a little bit different. And so it's like the Red Queen, you got to keep running. As the bacteria keep adapting, then you've got to change the angle of attack. And for a while, we were able to do that with generating these different classes of drugs, and to great success, But now the pipeline is really running dry, and that's why that's why the world is really starting to be very worried about it.
Mm-hmm.
It's like all the low fruit, in some sense, is being picked. And now we got to develop, we have to reevaluate on different fronts, which brings us to the whole talk tonight, really, is talking about, well, where are the critical control points, and then what are the opportunities, and so the good news is there is lots of room for optimism, and we'll get to that too. But the critical control points, and the WHO is leading this One Health project, global, education around this issue. But it's very difficult, because we have the world is growing, and our consumption of food animals is growing and will grow. And as we've talked before, we're headed from 8 billion people to 9.5 billion in your lifetime. And as we get more affluent, the first thing we do is eat more meat. So we're going to eat more animals, which means we need more animals. And so our drug use is predicted by by WHO again, or doesn't matter, UN, but to go up, in humans, to go up about 65% in the next 30 years. Yeah, because of our increased population, and then because of the huge number of people coming in the developing world, going to need a lot more drug, infectious disease problems. And then also an aging population in our part of the world. You need a lot more, they have a lot more persistent infections, like urinary tract, just as an example. So we're going to need a lot more antibiotics. And then in animal agriculture, our business, they're going to need something similar, 50 to 65% more antibiotics predicted.
And it seems like if we just take the look at the problem of antibiotic resistance, that's a highly conserved thing. These bacteria have the upper hand. They've been doing it for 440 million years, maybe something like that, developing and sending out their best fighters to fight other ones. And so they're really good at this.
Maybe more than billion years.
It might be more than that. Yeah. This, the one genus that a lot of the streptomycin, I think, is said to be 500 million, something in the soil.
Ancient.
Anyways, so old. We're talking, we've known about it for 100 years, and it's got a billion years of learning that we've done prior to that. So I think you were telling us about this maybe prior to this starting, the antibiotic resistance of compounds that we've developed today that would have no business of ever being exposed to it, that they found in caves, in remote parts of the world. And so it just goes to show that it's a natural process. Bacteria are always evolving and spitting out resistant progeny, or and so it's an ongoing battle. And it seems like today the public would like less antibiotic usage, and I think that's good. The judicious use of antibiotics is probably ought to be something that had been done a while back, but that's almost like a Band-Aid to me, when I think about it. It's like it's patching the wound. It's not really solving it. You're just slowing down the inevitable of creating more resistance, because we're not going to stop using antibiotics. More people, more animals, and you can't just let something that's sick go untreated. So we're going to end up using the antibiotics we have. Well, if there hasn't been a new one since 75 brought to the market, we're going to be using the same ones and developing, we might be using them at a lesser degree as each year goes by, but we're not bringing new products into the game to help with the new strains that have been identified. And so
you mean like new classes of drugs?
Yeah. New antibiotics.
We're bringing new antibiotics, but they're not novel classes. They're derivatives of existing classes.
Why aren't we
I
bringing
think that's the distinction.
Why aren't we bringing new classes since 75?
And so, well, there's a couple of reasons that we were hoping to get the chance to bring up, but there is a monetary.
I'm jumping the gun.
No, it's great.
Let's talk about it.
There's at the end of the day, it takes these big companies with huge resources to invest into, to uncover these new classes and to create new antibiotics. And the ROI isn't there is a big part of it. It's if an antibiotic is really good, it's only intended to be used for a short amount of time. So if it works, the sickness goes away and then you stop using it. And in general, antibiotics are being used less anyway. So you're developing something that is intended to not be used much.
Sure.
And the trials and everything that it takes to really bring that to market takes a lot of time. Ultimately, to be somewhat inexpensive, an expensive endeavor that doesn't have the payoff at the end. So the R&D component is hard to convince these big companies. I think there's 45 antibiotics in testing today. Only 2 of them are by what we would call big pharma. Everything else is small to medium sized. And so I think having some level of incentive there to invest in this area is probably needed. It's been, to finish my thought from before about the Band-Aid thing, that's kind of where I was going. Is it seems like almost reinvesting and looking into it more at the moment is the way to go, rather than just slowly withdrawing the use of them across time. It seems like that just delays the inevitable. I don't know what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah.
Is the goal to delay it and also be developing new technology and give yourself time to develop new technology? Or because if that's the case, then that makes more sense than if it's just, let's try to get a few extra years out of this thing.
That's back to, correct. That's how it should be. And I would think that it hopefully is what's happening. But when you see that only 2 big players actually in this area, it seems like maybe that part's not being held up.
Sure.
Yeah, I think there's the money pieces for sure. Their businesses, obviously, they're answerable to stockholders, and they would love it. They would much rather produce an antidepressant that you can take every day of your life, and hopefully remain depressed and keep taking them. But or a statin drug, you take it every day. That's what drives the money. And Tommy's point is valid. If you're just using it for treatment, if the antibiotic is efficacious, whether it's for an animal, a cow, or a person, 5-day treatment and you're done. So the money piece, and then also the regulatory piece, that becomes so precautionary. As we talked about before, when sulfur and penicillin first came to the market, there was no restriction. You could just buy it and sell it and make it, and there was no FDA or no agency to oversight. But now we have, maybe the pendulum's gone too far, that they're so precautious about trialing drugs, antibiotics in particular, that the companies are the cost to enter into that lottery system, or if you will, or that big. That it take 10, 15 years of millions and millions of dollars, and then the outcome is unlikely. It's something like only 2 out of 10 or 2 out of 15 drugs in the pipeline that make it to actually make it into clinical trials, the final trials period. Only 20% will ever get to market. So it's very risky for them to invest in. I think this is where governments actually need to play a role with research, using our great universities. I mean, we have the best universities in the world, and obviously other countries do too. So I think governments, in the interest of their own people and health, probably need to take a bigger role in developing antibiotics, novel antibiotics, because it's not that financially interesting for companies.
I think that's a little bit of the counterintuitive point, that most people in public wouldn't know that the solution is actually maybe more but different. More antibiotic but different antibiotic, actually, to stay ahead of the what's your analogy again?
The Red Queen from Alice in Wonderland. That's a phenomenon where you have to keep running forever.
So if you can keep introducing new classes, like we're saying here, which you're saying would be the way to go, is that also a finite timetable or game? Like, would we end up in the same situation? Are there a limited number of classes, or is that exponentially opens the doors to way more time?
That's the right question. I don't know if you have an answer or not, Dad, but it seems like that's one reason for optimism, is these natural, antibiotic that we've developed that come from the microbes, they really largely come from the soil bacteria, and the soil that's been tested for these turns out it's like a really, really small percentage of total soils. And so
Okay.
there's one paper that I read. Can't remember who it is, and I think you read it too, but we could put it in the notes of this episode. But that one talks through the potential for maybe thousands of others that are out there that haven't been identified yet. A bunch of new classes and maybe 1,000 different NPs, these natural products from microbes that have antibiotic properties that could be tested. I mean, that's just in different soils, and so there's a huge world out there that's untapped. That it seems like it's actually been underexplored.
Yeah,
because there's so much progress right off the bat. There's maybe a new class developed every year between the 20s and the 40s and the 60s. A new class was identified, but that was just using a couple different starting points, a couple different batches of soil maybe, and they developed that many out of it. And then the public started catching wind of antibiotic resistance and all of that, and it slowed down that whole story. And so, long answer, I think it sounds like there's reason for optimism to start exploring other areas to, and that starts with reinvesting and having some reason to incentivize the research rather than be disincentivized by the payout of it.
Wow.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Well, most of our antibiotics just obviously come from the soil, but they're coming from bacteria. Bacteria have been in a war forever with each other, because there's so many bacteria. Like even in our own bodies, people might be interested to know, but it's estimated we have like 39 trillion bacteria cells in our body. We call it the microflora, and the microflora populate our microbiome. Which also includes fungus and virus, but bacteria, about 39 trillion cells, and our self cells, who we are, is about 30 trillion. Mm-hmm. So there's more bacteria in us than our own human cells. And
that's what kept the microscope, Leo and Hook, busy
all those years. Very busy, very busy. Yep, yep. Exactly. So, but anyway, and there's that's maybe it's very fascinating. But the bacteria have been and there's so many different types of them. They've been at war.
So that's actually I forgot to bring that part up. I'm happy you did, because that's another area that when we think about reinvesting in areas to look at is the already tried compounds. A lot of them were only tested in vitro. But the thing about these bacteria is they act based off of their surroundings. So in some instances, they might be on the attack. In some instances, they might excrete things that are defensive. And so depending on what's going on at that time and place, they may have an answer for it. And so in vitro, think of a test tube, drop some stuff into this can right here and see how it behaves. That's a lot different than a biological system. So how it would actually behave in an animal or in a human. Wow. And so that's another area that seems like an area where it could make some progress.
Testing things that we already know in different, in real environments.
Yeah, because
different environments.
They have this duality. They can be very beneficial to us, some bacteria, and then but if you get out of whack, they can become very aggressive and destroy us. Yeah. So this is part of the nuance, And but what I was going to say is, we've got how we developed our drugs has been by finding them in nature and then synthetically producing them, isolating them and synthetically producing them. So their origin of all this killing ability of pathogens is actually it's coming from nature. We're finding it from other bacteria or viruses, and then we're harnessing it. And I think there's so much more to be had in that area, to be learned from how bacteria are using toxins as example to destroy each other, to create space for their own populations and so there's reasons there. I think, Jack, there's a lot to be learned there, and there is a lot of work being done in this area, and some significant significant papers have been published on more specified toxins that we can harness, that we get from bacteria, learn from them, and then we can target pathogens, the bad guys that we want specifically, like shoot them with a .22 rifle instead of shooting them with a shotgun. And our shotgun approach for the last 80 years has been, broad spectrum antibiotics, which means just scorched earth, kill all gram-negative bacteria in your body, in the hope that you get the one bad guy. And that's caused a lot of the resistance problem, or it's accelerated it, because here's what happens with humans. It's part of the story. We all know this. You present to the doctor, you bring your kid along to the doctor, and he's got an earache, and kid's crying, and then the doctor has to do something, and so he wants to send you home with some ampicillin antibiotic, because the mother or the father, no one's going to leave there without the drugs. So the doctor's under pressure, and he's like, well, what the hell? I might as well. It can't hurt. Maybe it'll spread from his ear to his throat. And so, but what you don't know is the kid will be okay in 2 days' time, Anyway, he goes home, and you give little Johnny his first antibiotic pill, and then you give him another one at nighttime, and then another one the next morning. But he already feels great. So now the other 10 pills in the bottle get put in the shelf because he's feeling good, and he runs around. He doesn't like to take the pills anyway. And so this is happening all the time, that we don't finish our course of antibiotics. Number one is we get it for a virus, like we got a sniffly throat, a sniffly nose, and we got a bit of a scratchy throat, and you get the antibiotic, but it's actually a viral infection. And antibiotics don't work on viruses. But, Susie's crying and she's got a fever, and it's like, I'm not leaving here till I get a bloody pill bottle. So we go home with it. That's first mistake, is that it was a misdiagnosis. And there was a paper published last year on U.S. hospitals, which are some of the best in the world. 56% of all antibiotics were misprescribed. In the paper published last year, or published in 2021.
On that point, part of it, not to interject, but they are used to screen sometimes for that reason. So if the identifying if it's bacterial or viral is tricky still today. And so giving an antibiotic is pretty easy to answer that question. If they get better, it was antibiotic, or viral took care of itself. If it's not, then it's viral.
Yeah.
And so
right. So that's good. Second, so that's your first mistake, is it was misprescribed. Second mistake is that mom or dad at home didn't have the child finish the course of antibiotics. So what that did is, you only gave it for 2 days, and you're supposed to have given it for 7 days or 5. And so you killed all the weak bacteria immediately, and maybe a whole bunch of non-target populations too. You killed the most sensitive ones immediately. The ones that were stronger and more resilient got to survive. So they're the ones that repopulate. So over and over and over, you do this millions of times with people and populations. You keep killing off the more fragile bacteria, and you allow all the stronger ones to survive. And now you're accelerating through pressure the stronger pathogens, and so you're pushing this adaptation faster. So this is a big problem on the human side, and then on the animal side, which of course we mentioned, but there's an awful lot of antibiotics used in animal agriculture for 2 reasons. One was for treating illness, like cows get mastitis, an infection of their udder, incredibly painful, and certain forms of it can kill cows, like E. coli mastitis. But so we have to treat it. That's our responsibility to the cow or the pig or chicken. And so we do treat it with a veterinarian, and hopefully there's a good outcome, whatever. But there has been another use of antibiotics. They discovered that using it at what we call a subtherapeutic level, a very low dose level, like a baby aspirin, compared to a regular aspirin, but a very low dose, and you feed it to the cattle or or the pigs every day, they grow better. This is called subtherapeutic antibiotic use, and as a growth promotant. And this was and it's still used widely in the world, like in countries like China, and then developing. Well, China uses more than probably like half the drugs in the world for animal agriculture. Just China.
Really?
Yep.
So this
for pigs mostly.
Therapeutic is for promoting growth, not
right,
for
Jack.
fighting.
Exactly, nothing to do with directly fighting disease, but
just like a byproduct of they found out that they grow better from giving them.
They do grow more, better, faster, more efficient.
Yeah, could be through bacteria manipulation, or if there was just subtherapeutic, subclinical things that aren't showing up as an illness, but are at a low level an illness that we're taking care of that would have been hindering the animal.
Is that still practiced here in the States?
Well, I think in the U.S. we're not allowed to do it anymore because of this whole reason of I think it's fair enough too. It's like when you look at critical control points, this is a way to put huge pressure on pathogens in a population like all the time. So I don't think it's smart, and it's a good thing it's been revoked here for as far as I understand.
There's a directive that came in 2015 called the veterinary VFD, Veterinary Feed Directive, and so that is where it takes what we call these medically important antibiotics, ones that have human implications that are also fed to livestock, and you need vets to sign off and write a script in order to use those. So one of the biggest things they did was they had to relabel all of these products that had growth promoting claims on them. Now none of these antibiotics will have these growth promoting claims anymore, and they can only be fed with the stamp of a vet signing off that they can be used. But there are still some overuse of that. But this concept it's in general it's good to do this, because if we aren't reinvesting like we talked about before, and we're using these human important antibiotics in livestock, that only speeds up the process of this resistance. But it's for sure an area that's going to continue to be cracked down on more and more in the U.S. I think they even have some funny punishments for if you get caught doing feeding it, or if you end up having antibiotics that weren't following the withdrawal times or something like that, and it shows up in the meat, you get your farm's name gets published, or your name gets published on this site.
Shameless.
And kind of get shamed. But I don't know how often that actually happens. I just know it's in the write-up of it.
Should we put the site up on the description? Shame.
Yeah.
Shame.
But it's an interesting idea, because when we think of antibiotics, we just think of only ones that affect human. We think of antibiotics all as the same, maybe, but there are ones that are used only for livestock too that aren't important to humans, and so using those doesn't seem to have a negative.
No.
Why are they not important to humans? Is it that they're just currently not important, or are they?
The mode of action doesn't benefit would be one main one. So ionophores would be a big one.
They have critically important and medically important, and there's different. Europe has a different standard, and we have one too. And then there's like common use, or sort of where both human and animals can be used, and they're sort of the older drugs mostly. They want to reserve like the big hitters for human use now, and fair enough, critically important. And there's only a few of them, and even some of them they're well, this is a real problem. Say you come out with a really novel drug that's highly effective on some of these real nasty staphs, like the flesh-eating staph disease, bacteria and strips. And but I know in spending time in China as example, we had vancomycin, I think that came on the market in the 80s, and that was like a super drug, because it could knock out all these, serious bacteria. Colistin is another one, super drug. But, the cephalosporins, super powerful. as example. But then, in China, here they are feeding it to animals, even though it's not supposed to be, but they're feeding it, using it as a growth promotant. And I mean, it's hard to police this stuff,
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Like in China, the official data says they use about 45% of the world's drugs on animals, mostly for pigs. But, there are reports of them using almost 100% of the known world's, antibiotic use. So it could be, 90 to 100% more.
Wow.
So it's hard to know what they're using. That's my point. It's like here in the U.S., as example, we use 7% of the veterinary drugs of the world. And the data is very accurate, and in Europe, the same, something similar, very accurate data. But my point is in the
and it's policeable here.
And it's
too.
policeable here.
Yeah.
But in the, China is the Wild West.
Yeah. Can't quite
And-
trust their numbers, huh?
No, that's the problem, So education is huge, Ultimately, they don't. This is a big problem, the education piece, because if the drugs are available, you can just buy them without a vet script in the Chinese province to feed to your pigs, and you don't know of any negative consequence to it. Like you've never heard of antibiotic resistance. All you know is you need your pigs to be healthy and grow faster. And then they have these black market chemical, pharmaceutical companies. They're pumping them out. Same is happening in India too. But and then so you have there's no mechanism to stop this. This
Why
is
wouldn't they do it?
right. Why wouldn't you do it when every pig is valuable?
Yeah.
So this is the other thing. There's an intense focus on the U.S. and in Europe, and of course New Zealand, Australia, that for their control of antibiotics, and that's good. I mean, okay, this is a good thing to be looking at, and but what we got to remember is there's a big piece of the world that is going to behave indifferently.
Not going to play by the rules.
Right, is exactly. And then I think you mentioned, Tommy, these antibiotic resistant genes, that the bacteria have developed, travel the world.
Yeah.
They travel with us, inside us, on airplanes around the world. I mean, they're highly transportable,
So it's not like it's just happening in China. They do their own thing. It's
Just their problem, yeah. So
going to be everyone's problem.
yeah, if we
pretty
do our
quickly.
job here, I think the stat is since 2015 when this came out, there's maybe 40% fewer, 30% fewer antibiotics being used in the U.S. That's great, but if everyone else isn't following the rules, it ends up being a quite minuscule impact on the overall big picture.
It's a similar story to what you hear with like emissions, or it's like we're so efficient in comparison, but we also produce like such a small amount, or not such a small amount, but
yes,
there's huge swaths of the world that are not even trying to address it, that are producing way more. And similar story here with the antibiotic.
And in some regards, these developing countries, they should have access to get these. I think we should bring it back up again.
Yeah.
There are really good things about antibiotics.
Yeah.
It's
Sure.
it's
good to
tough
give
because-
things that are sick, things that make them better. It's the right thing to do. And if it helps these people produce food at a
Correct.
higher rate that lifts them out of poverty, who's to say that's wrong?
I was going to say it's tough for, here we are, we've reaped the benefits.
Yes.
Again, like to make the analogy to energy, we've become rich off of fossil fuels, and then now we're to turn around and only to tell the developing world that they can't do the same.
Right.
We've reaped the benefits of antibiotic use, and then
Yeah.
it's a tough spot to be in if you're the developing world.
I know. I think this is so good, because it's so important. We have to keep developing, obviously, compounds. We have a responsibility to the animals to keep them healthy. But there's so much can be done with management, outside of antibiotics. And Europe has led the way on this, like Denmark and the Netherlands, I could signal out as being like world leaders in living without antibiotics and strategies for managing pathogens through exclusion and through competition, and they call prebiotics, probiotics, using acidifiers in the gut to change. And so very clever nutritional strategies, and then management, because a lot of bacteria are opportunistic.
What do you mean by management?
How you manage your animals,
Okay.
their environment, low stress, comfort,
Got it.
temperature,
Just everything.
air quality.
It's a catch-all.
There's 100 things in management that can make a massive difference to your health of your. Because they're being opportunistic. If you have an immune suppression event, well, just think about it. Everyone listening will know. If you got caught in the rain, cold as hell, and got wet and soaked and got chilled, there's very common, like 2 days later or the next day, you'll have a cough. You've got a cold. And it's because your body got immune suppressed by dealing with this environmental challenge to your thermal, challenge as example. It reduced your immune competence. So then opportunistic pathogens that are in you or exposed to you can take advantage of it. And this happens with animals that we're farming all the time. They get in trouble through bad air quality is huge, temperature, stress, physiological stress, psychological stress even can trigger health events. So we manage animals so much better. We can reduce our need for antibiotics like it's staggering.
And so kind of to piggyback off that, the subtherapeutic dose feeding of antibiotics, that would cover up a lot of poor management things.
That's right.
So if you pull that away,
exactly, you
what's
gotta
the way to make that
managers.
up again? Or antibiotics cost money, and so once people realize and start understanding, that management is a quick way to make up and actually become more profitable without having to spend it on the antibiotics. That has kind of pulled back the need as well for maybe using,
which is very motivating, because ultimately, if it's not gonna, they still have to make money. Like that's gonna be the most motivating thing in the end. In many ways.
So there's
for
reasons
the individual producer.
Yeah. And so there's some things like that are going to be real helpful, and then non-antibiotic interventions, as we mentioned, are becoming main practices in different. And then you can share that education now better than ever before.
What is it?
Internet,
What's a non-antibiotic intervention? Did we talk about that?
Probiotic.
Already? Oh, okay. Gotcha.
Could be one.
Yeah, that's using another beneficial bacteria, maybe like a lactobacillus or something. But there's others like acidifiers, so you change the pH of the gut, and then some bacteria are very sensitive to that, that kills them or provides an environment where they can't reproduce. There's a non-antibiotic intervention as an example. And then there's a lot of feed additives now being developed from herbal extracts and natural plant extracts that can, like oregano, and there's others I just don't know them off the top of my head, but
that's a big area of interest going forward. Kind of back to that point about, is it more or less the concept of it, is it a Band-Aid approach or not? But replacing antibiotics with non-antibiotics to cover some of what the antibiotic was doing is going to continue being a kind of maybe the next frontier of research, or at least one of them. A lot of that comes down to understanding the microbiome more, which is still.
But we're still going to need powerful antibiotics.
Yes.
Like there's no getting around it. So we got to have an emphasis on new, better antibiotics, and never stop in the pursuit of them, because you can't. They're going to adapt no matter what. So we need to adapt our strategy. I mean, we need to keep innovating.
Is there talk of how to? We already covered on the reason why it's not happening. It's not financially viable. and regulatory reasons. Is there talk in a significant way of addressing that kink in the chain? You know, that people aren't developing new antibiotics for that reason?
I think that's the disconnect. You know, people in public don't like the thought of antibiotics being used in agriculture, showing that a feasible solution or maybe the solution is to invest more in it. That part's not as clear yet. And so all these reasons to go away from antibiotics sound more appealing at the moment. And so bridging that gap, I think, is the challenge. And I think that's ultimately part of why we wanted to have this conversation, is to shed light that the history of antibiotics is, one, it's fascinating, but two, there's a real needle mover in terms of what, like, all of the good that comes from it. And so shying away from those technologies it might not be it isn't the best approach. You know, it's understanding the effects of them is great, and the side effects and the antibiotic resistance that needs to be recognized. But, you know, completely going away from antibiotics also shouldn't be the goal.
Yeah. Well, I think that's interesting what you just said, that you can, on the one hand, recognize and appreciate all the good that's come from it, and recognize that there is an issue here with how it's currently being managed, and and that they don't have to be mutually exclusive. You can say that there's going to be some challenges with how we've done it, but we also need to recognize these are really powerful tools that we should be continuing to use and get better at.
You brought it up at the beginning, you know, that never ever programs the no antibiotics ever. If it's not being backfilled with innovation, that is just a slow bleed, and it's not that's not a helpful solution. And so hearing that an animal didn't receive antibiotics, or did, to us, I know that doesn't make a difference on if we would purchase that food or not, because we know that food is safe and that antibiotics provide a good service. But if we're just going to, you know, a lot of people do select their food to, if it had no antibiotics ever on it, that would be a compelling sales pitch for them. And I think, I don't know how it happens, but getting that mindset a little bit shifted, it needs to happen sooner or later. Otherwise, it's just going to continue down the same path.
Well, no antibiotics never is also an ethical issue.
Yeah.
Okay, you might feel good because, this meat never had an antibiotic in its whole life. But what about all that? What about its cohorts, its brothers and sisters that, you know, that got sick, you know, and needed an antibiotic to get them well, but because they're being raised under this no antibiotic never, those animals just left to suffer.
But just to play devil's advocate, I think the way that these operations work is that they do, a lot of times they do treat them with antibiotics, but then they just take them out of that marketing channel. They go to conventional. So it's not so much that they're withholding care. It's just that if they treat them, which they should, responsibility, then they're no longer able to market it as a never ever.
To play devil's advocate, that's correct. But then to play it again, there's incentive to not recognize you know, that something is wrong, and see if the animal can get through it on its own. Because there's a premium to be fetched by having no antibiotic.
And it also you know, suggests in an overt way to the consumer that, you know, using antibiotics in animals is bad.
Yeah,
and it's not. Sure. I hope we've explained that. It's a much more nuanced, you know. There is no antibiotics in our meat. You know, per the FDA, there's a withdrawal period on all meat and milk. And so the residuals are almost, you know, they're near zero, you know, and certainly they've been proven to be safe. So we shouldn't be afraid of eating meat, even if the turkey, you know, was given an antibiotic or the chicken or whatever.
Or just don't eat turkey.
Yeah, or just eat beef. So that's number one. The other thing too is there's reason for optimism, and like we're so innovative as a species, humans, you know, ingenuity. We can continue to win this if we apply our ingenuity. So on the cost side, Tommy was talking about the cost of bringing a new antibiotic to market. Well, there's a way, you know, using technology, we can speed that up. Like I came across a couple of papers in the last 2 years where we've used AI, machine learning, the power of computers. So we would have to do, all this work in the labs, bench top work and culture and chemistry, medicinal chemistry. But now they can feed it into a computer, with using AI learning. And they I think it was a year ago or 2 years ago, they spit it out at MIT, a compound, completely new antibiotic called halicin that the AI intelligence of the computer came up with in hours. Novel chemistry versus years. So you think about the cost reduction of having this machine learning. How many different compounds could it build? In like a 3D sense. In a very elaborate molecule it can build, and in a very quick order. And then there's another paper I read on game theory, applying, like very complex problems and having the computer learn how to solve it towards a certain goal, like how to beat the defense system of a particular strep bacteria. So we know the defense systems that it has, and now you put game theory computing power to it to find its weak. And there's been some success. I read a paper published where they came up with another novel compound using game theory. Wow. So we're so ingenious as a species, people. I feel if we have the motivation to pursue this aggressively, we can do incredible things. There's no reason why we can't have another Fleming Domack moment.
I'd rather bank on that.
Yeah. Well, there's an example of both of those examples of solutions or potential solutions coming in forms of technology that you could never even fathom, when you were years ago, like AI, artificial intelligence. If you were 10 years ago or whatever this timeline is, 20, let's say, to make it safe.
Yep.
But you wouldn't have even been able to consider that in the game.
It's like Lumenhoek looking in his polished glass. It was like that moment again. You could never imagine AI. What the hell? Computing power that could do such a thing? I think.
Well, you love the topic of CRISPR, Cas9, but there's also some potential for CRISPR here.
Huge potential.
Yeah. Back to that in vitro concept and the duality of these bugs. They exhibit certain properties under this set of environmental, what do you call it, situations, and then different ones over here. If you can figure out how to genetically turn on the beneficial ones when you want them on, CRISPR has a role to play there, is my understanding too. And so figuring out when these genes need to be flipped on and which ones do, that's another area that CRISPR that's a new technology that back 10 years ago we wouldn't have known anything about that either. And that also might have some antibiotic help coming forward in the future with that one.
Well, I think for sure. CRISPR, does everyone know what CRISPR is?
Everyone in this room?
Yeah.
Yes.
I mean,
give us the quick 1 hour version of CRISPR.
Yeah, right. Well, we'll do it. But CRISPR is, the acronym CRISPR is clustered regularly interspaced palindromic repeats. Like, say that 20 times over. But it's incredible breakthrough that they found, Japanese researchers and then University of California, Davis, I think, Jennifer Doudna and a French collaborator have brought it into use in the world. It's a tool, a gene editing tool. But it comes, like, this is how great the story is. It comes all the way back to bacteria. It's the bacteria's immune system. CRISPR is a big part of their immune system of a bacteria for fighting viruses. Because they've been at war with viruses for 1 billion years. Mm-hmm. And what CRISPR does is it allows to take a snippet of the virus and incorporate it into its memory bank, if you will. So now it can recognize that virus whenever it's invaded by, and as that bacteria multiplies, like they multiply so fast, right? I don't know, like on a log scale. You start with 2 or 1, and you end up with like 1 trillion, like 7 minutes later. But all of the ones that replicate out of that bacteria have that built-in reference immunity to that virus. So it's a gene cutting tool that now we are being able to harness. So we can go in, and we're already doing so much CRISPR work now. And you can turn off genes by cutting them out, and you can also insert good genes in by cutting and pasting them in. So it's a bit like on your Word document. You could search for a word, cut it, and paste it, or replace it. Very similar. So in our fight against antibiotics, there's another really great research paper, I think it came out in the last maybe year. I think we're looked at turning the bacteria on itself to make them commit suicide. So you trick them into producing a toxin that'll kill themselves.
Wow.
By gene editing in this the sequence. So we're scratching the surface on what we can do with novel. See, that wouldn't be an antibiotic then either, but it's certainly a bactericidal approach that's novel and maybe very hard to build resistance to. So very cool.
It is.
A good it's just another good example of why investing in new technologies, banking on human ingenuity typically seems to be the right way to go. It's not to say that there aren't these concerns that we've talked about with antibiotics and resistance and things like that, but I would just say, I guess, that it seems that if the general take on antibiotics is a little bit too scared at the moment.
Sure.
There are some reasons for pause, but there's also all of the good that has come from it. And
and pause without reinvesting is ultimately going to be better than.
We need to be. I think that's a good place to kind of wrap it all up, maybe. But it's been a long and arduous, epic trail that we've traveled as a human species, and just it's just like in this recent blink of that we've enjoyed this incredible prosperity and health and longevity, like things have never, ever, ever been so good. And it's just happened in the last 100 years, like it's unbelievable.
If you got shot with a bow and arrow today, you wouldn't need to have your leg cut off.
Right. Gus would still be riding.
He wouldn't be hobbled.
Some say he's still out there. That was Jeremiah Johnson. But your point is taken.
Yeah, Jeremiah's for the next episode.
Oh, yeah, we got to talk about Liver Eating Johnson.
How do you get that name?
Yeah, boy, that's another podcast. But anyway, so here we are, and we do have challenges. The good news is we're acting on them, like the world, and all the way down to the individual government bodies, but all the way down to the local veterinarian, doctors and human health, veterinarians, farmers. Like the education level is, and awareness is very high now and getting higher. So we can be more judicial and prudent and targeted. And that means responsibility. But then we got to manage the ethic, our responsibility to the animals as farmers and producers, and safety for our consumer as well. But then we got to have this sort of, I think we got to have this optimism and aggressive pursuit of more ingenious. We as a people, as a nation, we have this. We must invest more on new strategies, new compounds, novel ways to fight this eternal war. Like the bacteria are never going away. We will be fighting them forever. And if Elon gets Mars colonized, we'll get up there and we'll be fighting frickin' bacteria on Mars. It's never going to end. Those bastards will travel with us.
Yeah.
And so we're in the eternal struggle, and we can win it.
There we go.
I think that's a good place to end.
We can win
Yeah.
it. Yeah.
All right.
Got it.
Love it.
Good on you. Cheers.